Hello, ladies and gentlemen. And if you were paying close attention, you'll notice that the theme song started there a little bit sort of late in its. The recording only started quite late, and that's because, like a fool, I forgot to push the go live button. But anyway, we are live now. So, welcome once again to another week of the Daily Friend Show. We have. I think it's today is indeed the last day of the first month of the year. So we now are truly into 2022. It's a weird year because it feels like we should be in the future. The first Blade Runner was what, 3 years ago? So things in some ways are better, in some ways are worse. But anyway, enough of that. Today I'm joined by Mr. Hermann Pretorius. Hermann, how are you? How's Pretoria?
I'm well. Pretoria is good. I moved into a new house, placey thing, so it's very nice. But I must say, in connection with your comments on January, I mean, what a year this month has been.
It has only begun, my son. And of course, we also have Mr. Marius Roodt. Marius, how is the sunny Easter?
It's quite sunny, actually. It rained a bit over the weekend, but it's sunny today. So yeah.
Oh, that was so interesting. Can we just stick to that level of analysis?
Nothing like small talk to start off the episode. And unfortunately...
I love a thing, eh? I love a thing.
Yeah, I love a thing. Unfortunately, we must deviate from our sunny small talk and talk about something that does concern me quite a lot. And this is about our neighbor, that country that we often have had a lot of good things to say about, but today not so much, and that is Botswana. So, according to media reports, the Botswanan government is seeking to fast-track what it's calling the Criminal Procedure and Evidence Controlled Investigation Bill, a piece of legislation that a lot of editors' forums, media houses, sort of human rights groups, that kind of thing, are very concerned about because they say that it will allow the interception of communication and the forced disclosure of information to state intelligence and law enforcement agencies. Presumably, this puts people like whistleblowers at risk, because if you are, say, reporting on the government, your identity could be, and it gets into the newspaper, state agencies could force them to give the details about who you are and what you know. What makes it worse is that the parliamentary procedure for this piece of legislation it's being done under urgency, which means that it doesn't have to go through the normal public scrutiny. Most countries have this thing where once a bill comes to the public's attention, it goes for sort of public scrutiny, and after a couple of months of people being able to comment on the bill, then it gets voted on in the parliament. Well, it looks like the ruling party of Botswana, the Botswana Democratic Party, has decided that this is urgent, and therefore they're going to rush through the parliamentary procedure, and it's not going to have the full scope of public engagement. And that's, of course, very bad because it means it's less likely to be modified and made less severe. Herman, let me start with you. Why should we care about what Botswana's laws are?
Well, I think it's always useful to pay attention to what's going on in Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. Madagascar, perhaps a bit lesser. Not Madagascar, Mozambique. Madagascar, even lesser. But these countries...
Madagascar.
Yeah, I mean, DreamWorks Animation Studios have I think they are technically the government of Madagascar. I'm not sure, some lemur or something. And they like to move it. But one of the things that I think is useful about keeping track of these countries' legislation is there is something of an opinion climate, a climate of opinion when it comes to Southern Africa. And it's quite often useful to see where South Africa might be heading, or where the rest of the region might be heading in terms of legislation that gains popularity in these countries and that become law. Namibia have for a long while actually gone down a similar path when it comes to property rights as South Africa, perhaps not in the last few years as aggressively with regards to expropriation without compensation, but making it increasingly difficult for people to securely own property. A bit of that happened in Malawi as well. But what concerns me about Botswana is if a traditionally center-right government is taking an action like this that is quite aggressively against freedom, against liberty, then it sort of, in my mind, gives cover to other governments in the region to adopt similar laws saying, you liberals, you classical liberals, you people on the soft right, you've always been champions of Botswana. Look, Botswana has just essentially passed a state security, or what's it, SO, state, I can't remember, Official Information Act, and we can do the same here in South Africa. And about 12 years ago, there was a similar piece of legislation that actually stagnated on the president's desk. It's still on the president's desk, that both chambers of parliament voted it through, and that was the so-called information bill, where this type of disclosure and to state authorities, and this the authority given to government to tap the phones and listen to specific communications of their citizens was expanded massively. So it's very, very dangerous when a country does this, because there is this regional climate of opinion. And I'm very disappointed in this, because I had President Masisi, I think he came to power shortly before he came to power as president. He said that the size of government, the bigger the government, the smaller the size or the space for the private sector to be innovative and take the country forward. So he needed to shrink the size of government in Botswana. And that's a typically, broadly pro-market position. But if you go look at, history, it's often the case that freedom, economic freedom, social freedom, these things go together. And if you want the one, you sort of need the other. And it is worrying that one of our neighbors who've been traditionally, I think, on the right side of issues when it comes to government interference or not, is taking this step. It does give cover, in my mind, to some other less, benign actors, such as our own dear ANC SACP government.
So it's kind of, Botswana is an interesting country to think about, because in 1960, I think it was when it got independence, or around there, 1962, somewhere around there, it was probably the poorest, 66. It was probably the poorest country on earth. It was probably, without compare, it had nothing. It had diamonds, maybe, and it was desert, and it had few people. And yet today it has a higher GDP per capita than South Africa, I believe. Its currency is stronger. It's had it's famously got less corruption than South Africa. I know that a lot of Zimbabweans prefer to cross through Botswana to get to South Africa, because you have to pay less bribes and get harassed less by government officials. But it's never had a change in ruling party, I don't think. And there's these kind of these elements of dictatorial stuff. Like if you go to Botswana, every sort of public place has a picture of the president in it, for example. And now we're seeing a piece of legislation like this. Marius, what's your take on this, and what's your take on how we should think about Botswana?
Actually, if you mean public places in any privately owned public place, there's a president, picture of the president, that is a problem. But I think
right.
if it's
like,
just in
like the Pick and Pay and stuff has a picture of the president.
But I think Botswana is actually, they have a bit of a Potemkin democracy. Actually, they've, as you said, they have never had a change in government since 1966. The same party, the BDP, has been in charge since then. They've had issues with lots of with some. They've got a bit of a strain of authoritarianism in the government. There was a famous case, you guys might not remember this, by a guy called Kenneth Good, an Australian political scientist, and he lived in Botswana for many years. 20 years or so, and he actually got deported as a prohibited immigrant in 2005 because, and for no reason, they just said we're kicking out, because he'd been very critical of Botswana, the Botswana government, the BDP, and he was kicked out of Botswana even after having lived there for many years, no reason, and it was obviously because he'd been critical of the government. There was a guy a couple of years ago, I forget his name now, but he was a Botswana journalist, who'd also been very critical of the government. He actually came to look for asylum here in South Africa because he said people were trying to kill him and so on. And we've also seen with Ian Khama, who was the president before Masisi, even though he himself had a bit of an authoritarian streak, he's been saying that the BDP and Botswana government is getting quite authoritarian, undermining democracy and so on. And just as an anecdotal story, a friend of mine, his uncle's lived in Botswana for about 15 years, and he runs a business there. He's paying his taxes in Botswana. He went to renew his residence permit, just said, no, sorry, we're not renewing it. You have to go back to South Africa. No reason given, just said, and I mean, this is a guy, he hasn't broken any laws. He's been paying his taxes in Botswana, been living there for many years, running a business, and you get told, okay, cool, you have to go back to South Africa. No reason given, and there's no pathway for him to get to citizenship or anything like that. So while Botswana is probably, one of the better run countries in the region, as I said, it's a bit of a Potemkin democracy, I think, and a lot of people hold it up as this shining beacon in Southern Africa, but there's lots of stuff that I think, if you scratch the surface, Botswana isn't this as great as people make out. And while it's in terms of the economy, it's been run pretty well, but it's so reliant on diamonds, and I know they've been trying to diversify, but they've been struggling. And once the diamonds run out, then Botswana is also going to be in big trouble, I think.
And something that also recently came from the BDP, and that's a further indication of my fear of this climate of ideas, is a stance against immigrant workers, where the Botswana government actually are looking, or already, I can't remember where they are in the process, of introducing limits on in which sectors immigrant or non-Botswana nationals might work there. So these are actually quite worrying signs, and I think it indicates a government that's, number one, been in power too long, so and number two, that it doesn't really have a mission. It doesn't really know what it's standing, because both of these, to my mind, seem to indicate a government in some fear, in some uncertainty. Number one is you cater to this populist nationalism that is really, sort of a heat of the moment type of thing. And we're seeing the same from a few parties in South Africa. Also, on the one hand, there's this populist tapping into this, insert applicable country here first, America first, South Africa first, Botswana first, Hermann first, sorry. Slipped out that last one. But the other thing is then a fearful government is usually one that wants to control information as well. Either fearful or paranoid, it could be rational or irrational. But the indications that the BDP are taking these two steps, firstly, to quite clearly tap into a populist strain of thought, and number two, to sort of ingrain or entrench itself even further in a position of power through quite authoritarian methods, indicates to me that the BDP is sort of losing faith in itself and doesn't really have a vision of what it wants to do in government other than stay in government.
Oh, I think that's probably right. All right, let's move on to our next topic. And speaking of immigration restrictions, ActionSA has been in the news a lot recently. They have got what would probably be considered by most to be a win, which is a long-time DA mayor for Midvaal, Bongani Poloi, who has a pretty good reputation in the mediascape, joined the party and gave a big interview to the Sunday Times, saying that he's got nothing against any of the DA leaders personally. He just thinks that the environment inside the party is not good stuff. It's not good. And so they could probably have been very happy with that as a win, except a video came out on the weekend on social media that showed ActionSA members at a meeting in Tshwane getting into a fight with each other. Someone told the media, although I think it was under condition of anonymity, that some people in the party had been promised certain positions in the Tshwane administration or in the Tshwane government or in the party's internal structures, and these promises weren't kept. So interesting times for ActionSA, because we're really now beginning to see whether the party is going to be COPE or whether it's going to be more like a sort of anti-immigrant EFF kind of thing, right? Although I repeat myself, I suppose, these days, ever since the EFF changed its mind on immigration.
It's a bit of a tautology, I think, talking about an anti-immigrant EFF.
So, yeah, it's running a party is very hard, as anyone who, if you look at any party in South Africa, can see not all of them are run particularly well. Not any of them are run particularly well. And I think this also, it's not just Tshwane where ActionSA has had internal squabbles. There's also been KZN where there was this little kerfuffle with their KZN leader. I forget her name now. Makosi Khoza. They've also had people writing letters to the newspapers in Joburg saying from Soweto, saying that they were undermined and that they were betrayed after working for ActionSA in the election and that kind of thing. I mean, it's difficult to know how seriously to take those particular complaints, but it's a tricky road that lies ahead, I think, for ActionSA. Marius, what do you make of all of this?
Well, yeah, it's, I mean, just taking it at face value doesn't I mean, that doesn't make ActionSA look positive or anything, but I mean, it's an isolated incident, and I think we have to withhold judgment till we see what's going on, say whether it's going to be another COPE or if it's going to actually be a party that can, be sustainable and challenge for power in 2024. Maybe what helps ActionSA is that, there isn't really a rival for leadership for Hermann Mashaba, not where COPE, where it was Masiwa Lekota and Bazima Shilova
Right.
and so on.
And more than that, I understand that his control of the party is much tighter in the sense of, as leader of ActionSA, he's got a lot more control over who stays in and who stays out.
Exactly. So, but that's also, I mean, that's not good for party in the long run. You need to party to choose its leaders organically and not have one guy who's kind of ruling with an iron fist. I mean, that's also the problem with the EFF, obviously. I mean, we all know that in 2030, John Steenhuisen won't be the leader of the DA anymore. Ramaphosa won't be leader of the ANC, but it'll take a very brave man to bet against Julius Malema not being the leader of the EFF. And probably same with ActionSA. Hermann Mashaba will probably still be, if it still exists or whatever the case is in 2030, Hermann Mashaba is almost certainly still going to be the leader of ActionSA. So I think it's a bit early to say whether this is signs of a disintegrating party. I mean, I think any party is going to have teething problems like this. And I think it's a reflection of South Africa's economic issues. If these are people who are just part of the party and they had their day jobs that they go to, and this is just what they're doing, after hours, but now I think it's the same what we see in Natal with people getting murdered for councillor positions. If you don't get a position in a city government or as an elected official, you are pretty screwed. You're not going to have a job. You're not going to be able to support your family. But obviously, if you become a councillor, or if you manage to get a position in one of the city governments as a bureaucrat or whatever the case is, you'll be okay. You're going to be able to live a fairly okay middle class life. But if you don't get that kind of thing, it's very hard out there. So I think that's why we see this kind of thing, and as I say, why we see it especially in KwaZulu-Natal with people literally getting murdered for positions, and that's probably going to. I mean, it's happening outside KwaZulu-Natal now. It could become
there was actually a story today
of
an ANC councillor in East London, I think it is, who's had multiple assassination attempts on her life. I just want to also add to that. I think that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, and just on the point of Bongani Baloyi, I do think that's quite a coup for ActionSA. As you say, he's got quite a good reputation, and I think if ActionSA runs things properly leading up to 2024, I think Baloyi would be a very, very strong premier candidate for Gauteng.
So I just wanted to add something to your economic opportunity point there. I think that's exactly right. But also, I just want to kind of, because, I've been a professional politician a little bit. So I just want to give people a sense of how, imagine the office you worked in. All offices, they often have like kind of cliques or people who hang out more together with each other. And, there's always certain people who gossip to each other, that kind of thing. Imagine those people in the office were in charge of your career path, whether you get promoted or not. And this is often why political parties have such toxic internal politics, is because, there's an awful lot of back scratching, promises that get broken, that kind of thing, because a lot of positions in political parties are elected rather than, you don't have necessarily a manager that appoints you. And that's why it's very difficult to manage a party. And ActionSA is really going to have to watch itself carefully because, as we know from COPE, if you don't keep a hold of all these strands and all these internal fights, very soon, and I mean the DA knows this as well, very soon the people inside the party will view their opponents inside the party as more dangerous than people outside the party. And you'll suddenly see ActionSA people leaking every bad thing the party does to the media, and it'll be a total disaster. Herman, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's important for a political party to know what it isn't. But also to know what it is, in the sense that I think COPE failed because it wasn't the ANC. It's not good enough to tell voters what you're not. You have to tell them what you are. And I think ActionSA fails that test a bit. What distinguishes it from any of the offerings that aren't already there? What's the purpose of ActionSA? Other than not being the ANC or not being the DA. And that's really, in the end, what sunk COPE, is you didn't have this you didn't have unity of mission, you didn't have unity of vision. And the DA also stepped into this trap with Mmusi Maimane specifically. It was marketed as, we're not the ANC, therefore vote for us. ActionSA is, we're not the DA, therefore vote for us. The problem that you really encounter here is when you have, and I suspect, this is suspicion, nothing more, I suspect that what happens at the top happens at the bottom level of a party. And in ActionSA, if the bottom levels of party representative positions were sort of promised and negotiated, and the party's coherence in that regard is based on these negotiations of patronage, it does put me, it does create this idea of, right, Hermann Mashaba got Makosi Koza, Fakey Mentor, John Moody, these Paul Bowie, Michael Beaumont, these former relatively heavy hitters or political beasts of some prominence, to join his party. And if you look at what they have in common, it is that they were unhappy with their previous political homes. You don't find that they have a shared vision of, free markets or command economy or, social liberalism or social conservatism. The only thing that they seem to have in common is political capital. And I think if you find at the top of a party its most senior, most prominent positions occupied because of the exchange of political capital rather than anything else, and you see that filtering down to your lower levels, that indicates that your party is probably going to fail the test of what it is and what it isn't. And I have a personal little, anecdotal test of trying to understand, is something a personality cult or is it a party? And that is, can you imagine the party existing without its current leader? The ANC, I can imagine existing without Cyril Ramaphosa. Even the ACDP, I can imagine existing without Kenneth Meshwe. I can imagine the DA without John Steenhuisen. I'm not so sure. I actually think that the EFF could have a different leader. I think there's enough there. But when it comes to something like ActionSA, it is based on the political capital and reputation of one man. And if, and there's a big if other positions in the party were also allocated based on political capital, what someone brings to the table, then you really are going to go down the Cope route, because there's no reason, if patronage and position is the only unifying factor, there's no reason for these people to stick around or play by the rules if the going gets tough. But when you believe in something, that you think that there's something your party can accomplish, like the Christian conservatism of the ACDP, that's an added bonus, an added benefit, not just your personal enrichment or the patronage network. So I think this bodes very, very ill for ActionSA, and I think it's been coming since these first high-flying, high-profile recruits came into the party as big coups for the party. Be very, very, very careful of those sorts of political capital parties, political capital joiners of parties. And I think Baloyi, he might be a potent candidate for the premiership in 2024. But that depends on whether the party can actually establish in the minds of voters more firmly, and in the minds of members, what is its unifying vision? What does it try to accomplish? And this is something I've said on the show before. Ideology isn't a vote winner, but it's a party unifier. And you need to have a party at least think along the same lines what they want to do with power. And ActionSA, I don't think they really clear that bar as of yet.
It's also quite interesting to me. So I know a bit about internal DA politics, and almost all of the people who've joined ActionSA from the DA are almost entirely of what used to be one faction inside the DA. So Bongani Baloyi and John Moody, for example, were long-time political allies. So I'm not terribly surprised by that. And I suspect there are probably people in the DA right now who are sitting there waiting to see if ActionSA is going to do well in the national government elections. And then when it gets a little bit closer to the time, they will probably jump ship to ActionSA. So just before 2024, if ActionSA is still doing all right, I wouldn't be surprised if you see a couple more defections of people who are already either in the ANC or the DA right now. Any final thoughts, Marius, on this?
Not really. I think Hermann raised some good points, but I do think I'm not sure that if Julius Malema was hit by a bus tomorrow, if the EFF would survive.
Yeah,
think,
I agree with I think the EFF would turn into what it always has been without Julius, which is the ANC Youth League.
Exactly. I think Malema, to a degree, holds the party together just his force of will, I think. And
But
without Julius Malema, yeah, I'm not sure. That's
the thing why I'm unsure about the EFF as a party rather than a personality cult is that they have such potential to tap into the far left identitarian critical race theory line of thought. They can monopolize that line of thinking. If Malema was to be hit by a bus tomorrow, I mean, firstly, poor bus, but secondly, if you were to get a leader of that party that could properly position it as the CRT party, essentially the Black Panthers party of exploiting that sort of identity politics and that sort of anger of identity politics, you can actually see it surviving as a movement, as a radical political party. But I'm not sure it is. I'm not.
And I think you can make the same argument
way.
about ActionSA, because if you just take ActionSA at face value, they free marketers, fairly conservative, and that's obviously something people are looking for.
But those aren't unique selling points. Those aren't unique selling points.
I think they're from the free market point of view. You're right, they're not, but they don't have the baggage that the DA has for many people.
Yes,
so people wanted to vote for a free market party, but they don't want to vote for the DA for whatever reason because they think it's going to bring the party back, or they don't like Helen Zille or John Steenhuisen, whatever the case is.
But I think the point is there's nothing ActionSA brings to the table in terms of ideology that is a unique selling point.
Some would argue that EFF ideology is found in the ANC anyway.
So. Yeah, so I think that's what I would say. Is the ANC does already represent the far left in a way.
Exactly. But there's identitarian stuff too.
We must move on to our last topic because we don't have a lot of time to talk about it. Very briefly, in Canada, there has been a massive protest by, mainly led by truckers who are opposed to the vaccine mandate. So the protests consist of people who are anti-vaccines in general, as well as people who are pro-vaccine but anti-vaccine mandate. It's worth pointing that out because that often gets lost in the sort of shuffle of all of this. And Canadian truckers have managed to form an enormous convoy of trucks and basically slow down a lot of traffic on roads. And this has caused quite a stir in both the US and Canada. So, Hermann, your thoughts on the post-COVID politics? What do you think this portends?
Well, I harbor a very, very potent and passionate dislike of the Canadian Prime Minister. I think he is amongst those figures that historically gives liberalism a bad name. He's the leader of the Liberal Party, but there's absolutely nothing liberal about what he does. His politics are not based on freedom. It's not based on the maximization of the individual to choose what they do with their time and their money and their opportunities. So, firstly, I strongly despise that man. And it's dangerous to say something like that, because if you say you don't like Justin Trudeau, you might at any moment be insulting any of the ethnic minorities he's dressed up as. But the real thing with the post-COVID politics is governments that have for 3 years now, almost 3 years now, 2 years, had the political capital to spend on lockdown should be very, very careful of thinking they can still cash those checks. There's a growing, frustration in Australia, especially, and the UK, where in the Anglican sphere or the Anglosphere, there really is sort of this realization of, hey, my goodness, there is this age-old thing called, British liberty or British liberalism, this idea that really differs from the continental idea of liberty, but where John Locke and the founding fathers of America find their ideology that the state has a role to play, but its borders does not extend to the minutiae of everyday life of the citizen. And what especially I think in Australia and Canada people should be scared of is in the UK there's this slight difference where you've got a prime minister under immense pressure. So what they want to do is shore up grassroots support, the more ideological part of the party that believes in classical liberalism. In Australia and Canada, there is just this assumption that the lockdown political capital can be spent for a few years to come. And I think the indication that this is not the case are in these sort of protests, where middle-class people usually were fine if the government left them enough alone, and they were sort of fine during lockdown. But these governments really are now pushing it beyond the point of, I think, practicality. Post-COVID, you will see parties becoming more distancing of themselves in terms of COVID lockdowns, because I think people will start looking back with more frustration than they endured of lockdown while they were living through it.
Marius, in 30 seconds, your thoughts.
Don't have too much to add, but I just think it's one of these, it's such a cleavage in the culture wars. If you think maybe the truckers have a point, even a little, even if you slightly agree with them, then you're obviously a mad fascist. And if you think, maybe they should be threats in a different way, you're obviously a libtard cuck. So it's one of these, just as with a lot of stuff, just these stupid cleavages, and it's all sorts.
We just want to make sure that cuck is the English. You're not veering into an Afrikaans bilingualism there.
No. C-U-C-K.
Oh, no. Well, thank you for raising the tone of the debate on the show, Marius. All the discussion of this show. But anyway, that's all the time we have for today. So thank you very much for watching, and we will see you tomorrow on the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone.